telling this story, telling this narrative, musically speaking, it gives us hopefully a sense of empathy for what's been happening in our world.
Good morning and welcome to Washington Post Live and another in our series on race in America, Giving Voice. I'm Jonathan Capehart, Associate Editor at the Washington Post. This is also being co-produced with the Capehart Podcast. Well, May 25th will mark the third anniversary of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Inspired by Floyd's life and the promise of an equitable future in America, the Minnesota Orchestra commissioned composer Carlos Simon to create a musical piece reflecting these ideals. The work is called Breath, and joining me now is its composer, Carlos Simon. Mr. Simon, welcome to Capehart on Washington Post Live.
Hi, Jonathan. It's so good to see you. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. So let's just start at the beginning. Briefly explain what Breath is and also why it's styled so specifically.
Sure. Well, the piece in itself it's in memory of George Floyd. But it's not focusing on the moment, the horrific moment, and these 10 minutes where there's a knee on the neck. The piece, it's really about, the systematic racism that we experience in America, and also what we do after this. The breadth of the task. And Mark Bamuthi and Joseph, my collaborator and librettist for the piece, one of the things that we wanted to explore is how do we deal with this trauma, this issue that we are plagued with in our country and the world, this issue of systematic racism. And how do we deal with it on the musical level, on artistic stage, if you will. And the piece we wanted to use the piece as a platform to discuss and to deal with these issues and to give a call to action, if you will, to those who hear it and in the hall, but abroad, just to give us a sense of where are we going with this, how do we make a change? And that's really the task that we set out to do when we wrote this piece.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I found very interesting in terms of how you and Mark Bamuthi Joseph went about doing this is you didn't just get together and decide to sit down and create this music, this piece for the Minnesota Orchestra. You went to Minneapolis and you talked to the community. I'm fascinated by that. How does talking to the community inform the piece that you delivered?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was an important process for us. We took 3 trips over the span of a year and a half or so. And one of the first places we went was George Floyd Square. And we spent a lot of time there, I think it's 4 hours, just kind of sitting in the space and just talking to people, honestly. And what I discovered was just spending time there. It was the neighborhood in itself. It was not much different from the neighborhood that I grew up in. There'd be times where we sit on the porch and have some iced tea and just, and then people would drive by and then say, "Hey, how you doing? How's your mama doing?" And it would be like that. And so people in the community were still there, even though they were people like Mark and I were just visiting. But the body of the community was still there, and they were a part of it. And we were talking to them, and then people would drive by and speak and say hello. And so that informed, the work. It's like these are everyday people, and like what happens when the cameras leave. we all experienced, what happened. In DC, I've lived there, and I saw what was happening on the news, right? And that has a certain narrative, but being on the ground and talking to people and getting all these details, all these nuances, and when I sat down to write the piece, um, a lot of that informed the work. A lot of that informed the music. And Mark will say the same thing. We've been talking back and forth about creating the work, but being on the ground and just walking around and talking to people, that really helped us to write the piece.
Hmm. So I don't know if you know this, but I went to college in Minnesota. I visited George Floyd Square now 2 years ago, so I can visualize what you're talking about. And I also remember George Floyd Square before it was George Floyd Square, from visits to Minneapolis. And I am curious, Carlos, how do you translate the pain, the frustration, disappointment, anger, maybe even hope and everydayness of the people that you met? How do you translate that into music?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, and I don't know if I have a direct answer, but it's in a way I do consider myself as a conduit. It's not only channeling something from a higher power, but also channeling the energy around me that I've embodied. And when I sit down at the piano, I'm literally trying to turn the analytical side off. That's saying, oh, this is a C major chord, this should go to an F sharp or D major chord. It's none of that. I am really just kind of thinking that I'm just embodying the energy that I feel and into music. And as I sit at the piano, it something takes over, and it really is something that I can't explain, Jonathan. And I wish I could, but I I'm a so if you I play jazz. I also play gospel music, which is an art form that is heavily based in improvisation.
Yeah.
And so I'm using that tool of improvisation to channel the music, and some kind of way it comes out. And this piece in itself, the music came out of me,
Hmm.
and it felt like I was channeling something different there. So I don't know if I answered your question or not, but
No, no, no.
that's the process of things.
No, I totally get what you're saying, and maybe, I mean, I'm not an artist like you're an artist. I'm, just an opinion writer, but I have had those moments where I've sat down with people and I've interviewed people, and just the emotion of the moment or of the subject matter, and I'm trying to be analytical and trying to, how do I write this, but then something takes over and I just write, and it comes out. But you're doing that via music, which to my mind is infinitely harder. I want to bring something up that Mark Bamuthi Joseph said when talking about Breath. He says Breath considers American promise and American history, written by two people that have an extraordinary relationship with American possibility. From your vantage point, what is the American promise?
Mm. Wow, heavy question. It's a lot, and I believe that the American promise is one that we if I'm a black artist, for instance, I want to be able to pursue my artistic journey without the issue of race being a factor, or pursuing it without the idea of um, capitalism and that issue of me being black, being able to kind of tap in, and being heard not only as a black artist, but as a composer, as an artist who is reflecting our times. I have this quote that I subscribe to, and it's Nina Simone,
It's
and it
Simone
says,
quote.
"Artists,
Know it
yes,
well.
yes." He says, artists should reflect the times in which they live, and I want to be able to do that. And of course we are living in a very, very tumultuous time in our country and the world, and It's difficult, but I think the role of an artist is to show us what we're experiencing in our world. And the American promise, I think, lends itself to the artist to be able to do that freely. And not just, of course, I'm speaking from my side as an artistic, you know, writer, but, everybody has their duty. Everybody is gifted with something. And I believe that tapping into that gifting and using your gift for better change, that is the promise that we should be able to do, no matter what our artistic giving or whatever our gifting is.
You said you were unsure about working on Breath because, and I'm going to throw your words back at you. You said writing a piece in response to such a horrific event was something I wasn't prepared to do. It had been done before, and I had already written pieces that responded to Black Lives Matter and police brutality. How was this project different?
Well, and that's one of the reasons I said yes, because I talked to Bamuthi, and he says, "Listen, I think we could say something different. We could really, really, really try to look for the future, not to focus on those 10 minutes that we all saw on TV, but to look past that, and to include it. Yes, we aren't going to talk about it in the piece, but what is the breadth of the task at hand? It's a call to action. It's what do we all have to do collectively in order to make a better future? Um, One of the most powerful things that he says, and it's the last movement of the work, is so much work has been done, but who does the work that's still left? And that's the last line that we hear in the piece. So in a way, we are Bamuthi and I, we wanted to for the audience to leave with something, leave with a call of action. What is my duty? What is my purpose in making the world a better place? And to combat racism. If racism is systematic, anti-racism also has to be systematic. And so, what is your part in that system?
How would you describe Breath for those who haven't seen it yet? Because didn't it just debut? Didn't it just premiere?
It's tomorrow. Tomorrow, yeah, we have the
Oh,
debut
yeah.
tomorrow.
Oh, it is Thursday, May
It is.
18th. So,
Yeah.
so, uh, so for who? Well, let me backtrack. Who are your inspirations when it comes to composing? Like, do you have a favorite composer or musician who for whom like you go to that well when seeking inspiration?
Well, it really depends on what I'm writing. But I love gospel music. There's nothing like gospel. I grew up with listening gospel music. In fact, we couldn't listen to anything else in our house
Yeah,
other than
because
gospel.
your dad's a preacher. There are
My
three
dad is
generations of preacher, right, in your family?
3 generations of preacher. Yes, yes. And so we very conservative house. We could maybe sneak in a little jazz, maybe a little classical, and then in fact, that's what opened my ears to, with the off chance that there was classical music playing on the radio in the car. And I was like, what is that sound? It's incredible. And so that led me down the path of discovering, Beethoven and Rachmaninoff and
Oh,
Tchaikovsky. I
Rachmaninoff.
love Russian composers. I love Russian composers.
Shostakovich, come on.
Yes, Shostakovich. I love it. It's something in the music it's just rich, and I gravitate to that, to that sound, but also blending those sound of the Western classical idiom with gospel music and jazz and the music that I grew up with and I heard every day, all the time. And so that's really been, the my mission to kind of blend these worlds and so any composer that can do that has been doing that. I'm thinking about composers like Aaron Copland, who's known for the American sound, and classical music, but also composers like William Grant Still, who are African American. The dean is considered the dean of African American composers. Florence Price, and these are composers who are using music of the people, folk tunes, if you will, and bring it to the concert stage and bring it to orchestras and classical music. So that is where I'm, those are my inspirations, following a model.
So I asked that question because I'm trying to get a sense of what breath will sound like. It's 4 movements, but I have now a better understanding between, and I cannot wait to hear this mix of gospel, which I'm sure I'll hear the influences in there. But, Rachmaninoff and Shostakovich, those are acquired tastes. And I love them because they're big, they're dramatic, they're sweeping, they're almost cinematic. And then you throw in Aaron Copland, and it seems to be it's your work. So you tell me if I'm wrong. But is that what you're going for with Breath? Is this deeply American, deeply African American, but with a sweep and a range that soars beyond the subject matter that's inspired this work?
Sure. Well, the piece, the forces that I have is massive. We have rehearsal yesterday, and it's 250 people on stage.
Holy
Right.
smokes.
So we have the orchestra, which is about 80 plus, 90 plus people on stage. And we have a choir, which is about 150 or so. And then right dead center is Mark Bamuthi Joseph. He is a spoken word artist. And really, he is the griot of the, he's speaking and, the soloist. He's dead front center. And I built the piece around him and what he's speaking. So musically speaking, yes, you will hear very like sweeping the orchestral, angular, melodic lines in the orchestra, which is very akin to Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff. But I have to pare it down. I kind of go in with the gloves on because I want the text heard. Well, sorry, with the gloves off. I'm making a boxing metaphor. But just allowing the text to come through, because I do want people to hear it. It's not just about the music in itself. There are moments where I bring in the orchestra, and it's just the orchestra by itself playing. In fact, one of the works, I wrote a piece called Elegy in 2014 for Trayvon Martin, and it was one of the first pieces that I wrote that was, I guess, socially driven to like social justice, and it made sense for the piece to live within this work because it was for Trayvon Martin, and that was in 2014, and here we are, years later, and the list of people of Black bodies that have been murdered. It has grown exponentially. So it made sense for the piece to live in the work for George Floyd. And that piece is it has very lush lines. It's very romantic in the nature. And it's just for strings. So very intimate. So I wanted to pair it, really, really bring it down there. Of course, there are moments where it's just Mark, and like he has this idea. I mean, it feels like he's like in a coffee club, So I have the orchestra play very lightly, almost like jazzy blues. They're bending, bending the strings, and the horns are sort of like in a very Duke Ellington sound. But so the piece in itself has a lot of varying styles ranging from Tchaikovsky to John Williams to Duke Ellington to and so many others. But I'd like to consider myself as a composer who likes to draw on different idioms and musical styles.
Well, you've mentioned his name many, many times, Bamuthi. This isn't your first time working on a piece together. What's it like working with him, and why is he seemingly the perfect musical partner?
Yeah. Uh, I, that's my brother. I feel like we share a brain, and I met him on the we were working together on a concert in Arizona, and the concert was around classical music and the idea of classical music being I guess a conglomerate of so many different things, and how the stories can be told on the classical stage, many different stories, and including composers of color and women, and so many other composers that you don't hear about now, other than Beethoven and Bach and the standards, and we connected on that level, and I was like, we have to work together. And at that point, I had just moved to DC, and he was there at the Kennedy Center, and we got the position at the Kennedy Center a couple years later, and we started working on a piece that was around this idea of social justice, and really both of that. Really, to answer your question, and we both had this platform for social justice, and using art as a means of telling a story, and hopefully giving some change. But we are on another level. We're both Morehouse graduates. Shout out to Morehouse College. And even though he's 10 years older than I am, I have to get on him about that. But we share that. We share that, and of course, it's storytelling.
Right, right. You are a Grammy-nominated composer. Your album Requiem for the Enslaved was nominated for the 2023 Grammy for Best Contemporary Classical Composition. And the project was inspired by the enslaved people who were sold by Georgetown University, where you are currently serving as an assistant music professor. Talk to me about that project and how uncomfortable or comfortable it was to write a piece that held the mirror up to the institution you work for.
Yeah, when I joined in 2019, the university was already doing work to understand its role in slavery, and I wanted to join in the conversation on an artistic level, and so I went to the top, went to the provost, and said, "Hey, listen, I really want to write a piece about this," and they were supportive. They sponsored a trip for me to visit the plantations down in Maringouin, Louisiana, where many of those enslaved people were sold in 1838. I got a chance to take a trip there for a whole week, and talk to people, talk to descendants, and go visit the graves where many of those enslaved people were buried. And again, it's some of the same type of research, and it just embodied that emotion. But I came back and I wrote the piece, and I visited the archives at Georgetown, and then actually seeing the bill of sale where actually the names of 272 souls were 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 listed, with their ages and their relation to one another. So looking at that bill of sale, yes, it's a document that has seemingly, very trite information, but for me, there was story there. There was something. The humanity was in the document, and that's what I wanted to bring in the piece. It's to show, what is it like to be owned by a person, and to feel like you are not a human, and to be listed on the same document as wheat and barley, and having a price assigned to you. So that was, the goal of the piece, is to honor these men, women, and children, but also to show how slavery is linked to systematic racism,
Mhm.
and can't get away from that.
So when you went down and you visited the graves, I'm just curious, were the graves marked or were they unmarked?
It's so crazy. So in South, especially in Maryland, um, it was two sides of the cemetery. It's where one side where you have the white people were buried, and but you have the black side. And you could see the graves were sunken. Could barely on the black side. You can barely tell. There was maybe like some headstone there sometimes, but on the white side it was completely risen for some reason, and it was very striking to see. Um, but I was able to see, there was some of the descendants were able to mark the graves where they knew that their descendants were, and they gave us a tour. I went with some other professors and some students as well. So yeah, it was
Well,
just really mind-boggling to see.
well, I asked that question because for my MSNBC show, I did a story that was on the front page in the Washington Post about a Black family that bought a plantation house, and it turned out that that family, their ancestors were enslaved on that plantation. And so they gave me a tour, and they took me to where the enslaved were buried, way away from the house, just in the middle of some trees,
Yep.
and the sunken graves and just a rock. And depending on the size of the rock, if there was a rock, they kind of figured if it's a big rock, it was an adult; it was a little rock, it was a baby. And just to see that with my own eyes was just to think, these folks, it was as if they were thrown away. And
Sure.
so I'm wondering for you, in seeing those graves, how that may have moved you or impacted what you ended up composing.
Yeah, well, I mean, there were a lot of these moments where I I embodied it, and there was actually one moment where I went to the actual plantation. It actually still exists with sugarcane.
Hmm.
Um, they went from these enslaved people went from cropping tobacco in Maryland to cropping sugarcane in the sweltering heat of Louisiana. And the moment where set foot on this plantation, it was a massive field. I mean, it had to be at least 2 miles, and it was completely. It wasn't in the sugarcane wasn't in season, so it was completely um, flat. And I could see all the way through for 2 miles at least. But what's striking was a tree right in the dead center, in the middle of the field, and um, along with that, there was right where I was standing was a bell, which signaled that they were still there. And oftentimes, the masters would ring the bell to cue a different shift in the day. And ringing that bell, imagine how terrifying that would sound to say, "Oh, it's time to go to another job in this sweltering heat." And seeing all and just kind of being in that space. It was just the experience in itself was uh, life changing. And when I got to again, when I sat down to write the piece, the piano, the music kind of came out of me, and
Hmm.
because I was so emotional, I was so embodied all these experiences, and it's like I had to get it out. I just to
Hmm.
release it, and I'm so grateful for music have that, just to be able to, it's an outlet, you know.
A release.
Yes.
Last question for you, Carlos. In the end, what do you hope people take away from Breath once they've heard it?
Mm. It's very simple. Call to action. What's your task? What is your duty? You all have a gifting, but what is your job? And dismantling racism, but also being a part of the anti-racist system. And yes, my job is music, but someone else may have a different position, a seat at the table that will embody some change.
Hmm.
And so my hope is that those who listen and who are there at the performance, they will be able to find some sense of duty, call to action, and be able to spark some change.
The next time we get together, I'm going to have to ask you about the Blacknificent Seven, but we don't have time. we are out of time. Carlos Simon, Grammy-nominated Kennedy Center composer in residence and composer of Breath for the Minnesota Orchestra. Thank you so much for coming to Capehart on Washington Post Live.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here.
And thank you for joining us. To check out what interviews we have coming up, please go to WashingtonPostLive.com. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, Associate Editor at The Washington Post. Thank you for watching Capehart on Washington Post Live.